Vi confermo che siamo in diretta.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, and welcome. Buonasera, buonasera a tutti e benvenuti. My name is Francesco Izzo. I am speaking to you today from Southampton, England, and thus it is 11 p.m. for me. It is now midnight in Parma, Italy, and it is 6 p.m. on the east coast of the United States. I've been very pleased to receive this invitation from my friends and colleagues at the Teatro Regio in Parma and the Festival Verdi to speak to you about Verdi. The invitation indeed came as a very welcome thing. At the same time, it also felt a little bit intimidating. I am a musicologist and a music historian and a pianist. I'm a professor. I teach at the University of Southampton here in the UK. I am also the general editor of the works of Giuseppe Verdi, a series that publishes all of Verdi's works in critical edition. And I am the direttore scientifico, the scholarly director of Festival Verdi in Parma. So you might think that I know a thing or two about Verdi, but the thing is that every time you are asked to introduce Verdi to someone, it is a little bit of a daunting task. So I hope you will bear with me. I know that out there are people who already know a lot about Verdi, and you will hear things that you already know. There will be people who have certain knowledge or ideas about Verdi, and perhaps we're going to apply a little bit of pressure on those ideas. Finally, there are people who are here because they're curious and interested and they want to know more. I will try to cater a little bit to everyone's interests, and I hope that the next 40 or 45 minutes will be enjoyable for you. There is a PowerPoint presentation which is now visible on your screens, and it will remain on throughout my talk. And then as soon as I'm done, I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint, and I will be very happy to field any questions that might be coming from the audience. The title of my presentation this evening is, as you can read on screen, Giuseppe Verdi, A Few Introductions. And I've chosen this title precisely because I didn't want to say that I would introduce Giuseppe Verdi tout court. I didn't feel that that would be appropriate. Rather, what I want to do in the next 40-45 minutes together is look at some aspects of Verdi's life and of his career as a composer and as a creator of some of the most beloved operas in the canon. This talk will be divided into several sections, each of them touching on various themes. And we start, I have to say, not from a happy subject, but things will get better from here. We see here Giuseppe Verdi on his deathbed. At 2:50 a.m. on January 27, 1901, Giuseppe Verdi died. He was in a suite in the Grand Hotel in Milan, where he was spending the winter, and in the morning of January 21st, he suffered a massive stroke, from which he never recovered. News of his imminent death spread quickly, and with an extraordinarily moving gesture, citizens of Milan covered the streets of Milan around the hotel with straw so as to dampen the noise of horses and carriages and to protect the peace of the maestro's final hours. Verdi had left clear instructions for his funeral, requesting a simple private ceremony. His will ended with these words that you can now read on screen. I order that my funeral be extremely modest and take place either at break of day or at the evening Ave Maria, without singing or playing of instruments. I do not want my death to be accompanied by any of the usual forms of expression. In his friend and collaborator Arrigo Boito's words, Verdi only wished to have one priest, one candle, one cross. In accordance with his wishes, Verdi's body was taken to a provisional tomb in the Cimitero Monumentale in Milan at daybreak, in a ceremony that was intended to be private, although it did attract a fairly large crowd. A month later, however, when, according to the composer's wishes, the remains of Verdi and his second wife, Giuseppina Strepponi, were translated to the chapel of the Casa di Riposo, the care home for musicians that Verdi had funded, a second ceremony took place. Verdi had left no instructions for that second ceremony, And so the authorities and the people of Milan had it their own way. A massive state ceremony with authorities, live music, meaning several hundred musicians conducted by Arturo Toscanini, and an immense crowd. The population of Milan in 1901 was just over 490,000 people, so a much smaller city than Milan is today. And it is estimated that some 300,000 were in attendance. On your screen now you see one image from that day in 1901 when Verdi and Giuseppina Strepponi's bodies were translated to their final resting place. And here is another equally impressive image showing the streets of Milan flooded with people. Again, about 300,000. In recent decades, we have become accustomed to extraordinarily large crowds assembled at the funerals of prominent public figures, typically political or religious authorities. Many of us can think of important examples within our living memory. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Lady Diana, Pope John Paul II. But it is not quite as straightforward to think of an artist, let alone an opera composer, whose death would command similar public participation. Today, we can try and understand how such a massive crowd gathered to pay homage to an opera composer. To be sure, when Verdi died, there was this aura of legend that surrounded the great old man, the Gran Vegliardo, as the Italians affectionately called him. That aura of legend owed a considerable amount to biographers who, in the later part of the 19th century, produced anecdotal accounts of Verdi's life that were, in many ways, far from accurate. One such biography, which makes for a wonderful read and which, make no mistake about it, is actually highly informative, is the one by the French critic Arthur Pougin, which was initially published in 1881 and subsequently issued in French and English and other languages. In the 20th century then, as the life of Verdi progressively became part of an increasingly distant historical past, scholars have sought to develop a more accurate, a fact-based perception of the life of this composer and indeed of many other 19th century personalities, separating documented facts or events from myth-making and offering a critique and, in some instances, a radical revision of unverified information and common assumptions. Furthermore, recent critical theory has placed biography, the act of telling or writing about someone's life, as a genre and as a scholarly endeavor under serious pressure. Indeed, the question has recently arisen as to whether all biographies, as well as biography as a genre, qualify as fiction. And in the case of Verdi, it is really very tempting to look at his life as a work of fiction for reasons that we're now going to explore. Let's talk about the land, first of all, la terra. Giuseppe Verdi was born in 1813, on October 10 of 1813, in Roncole, a small village outside Busseto, into a family of small farmers and tavern keepers. Indeed, he was born on the second floor of a locanda of an inn in Roncole, which was run by his parents. Pougin's biography describes the family context in these words that you can now read. His father and his mother kept in the impoverished village a very modest inn whose revenue was far from sufficient for the needs of the family. It is for this reason that to what the inn produced, they had added a small shop where they sold liquors, coffee, sugar, tobacco, and other similar goods. Indeed, Verdi's family were not wealthy. But it is fair to say that they were also not terribly poor. Here we can see a little bit of the myth-making. Verdi, the poor man from very humble origins. Verdi, the peasant. We're going to return to this. There were others who were much more poor than Verdi. Another great Italian composer, Gaetano Donizetti, for example, truly was born in utter poverty into a family of weavers and tailors who shared a single-room basement in Bergamo. Verdi, however, remained deeply attached to his homeland. Throughout his life, his home base was actually within shouting distance of that inn in Roncole. In 1849, he moved into a residence in Busseto with Giuseppina Streponi, and 2 years later, they settled into a farmhouse at Sant'Agata, which remained their home for the rest of their lives and was progressively enlarged into the stunning property, the Villa Verdi, that can be visited today, or at least can be visited when we're not facing a pandemic. Here are a couple of images of the property that Verdi acquired in the early 1850s and where he was based for the final decades of his life. In 1863, responding to rumors that he intended to relocate to Paris, where he had in fact been spending plenty of time during the late 1840s and the 1850s, Verdi wrote to a close friend with these words: "I was, am, and always will be a peasant from Roncole." But let's be clear and debunk one of the myths surrounding Verdi's life. Verdi was no peasant. Steady income from royalties and fees made him not merely financially secure, but also actually wealthy. And Verdi himself, a brilliant business mind, was pivotal in developing increasing recognition, protection, and remuneration for intellectual property and copyright in mid-19th century Italy. He was, moreover, a landowner with a keen interest in farming, one who wished to be viewed as a man with a natural inclination to connect with common folk. It would be erroneous to suggest that that inclination was not sincere, but Verdi's statement to Arriva Bene that you see here in this slide was actually a gesture of self-fashioning. This is an image of the inn in Roncole, where Verdi was born. It still looks pretty much like this today, even though it is surrounded now by other buildings. It looks a little bit more urban than this. Let's keep in mind why Verdi was talking about being a peasant from Roncole, and when he wrote those words. That's what we really need to keep in mind. In 1863, at that stage, Italy had recently undergone profound political transformation, as many of you know. In 1815, when Verdi was 2 years old, following the fall of Napoleon and the restoration brought about by the Congress of Vienna, Italy had been divided into a number of small states, mostly under foreign rule. The restoration then marked the beginning of a period known as the Resurgimento, which is a cultural and political process that led to the end of Austrian domination in substantial portions of the Italian peninsula. So in 1859, the Kingdom of Piedmont, or the Kingdom of Sardinia, it was actually called, prevailed over the Austrian Empire. And at that stage, Lombardy and several duchies in Italy were liberated, so to speak, and they were annexed to the kingdom of the nascent Kingdom of Italy that was then established in 1861. One of those duchies, by the way, was the Duchy of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla, where the Festival Verdi takes place now. With the Kingdom of Italy just recently established, Verdi wished to reinforce his ties not only to his land, intended physically as the Po Valley between Parma and Piacenza, but also to his fatherland, La Patria, as it is called in Italian. Those of you who know and love Verdi are probably aware that La Patria is a concept that surfaces frequently in Verdi's operas, most famously in the chorus of the Hebrews in Part 3 of Nabucco, the opera that marked Verdi's first sensational success in 1842, effectively launching his career. I now have a video of this course, and I'm not sure that it can actually play through through our PowerPoint. But I will give it a go. We'll see if it works, and I will get feedback from our technical support in Parma in case this doesn't work. I trust many of you know this, but still. Okay, I'm told that actually the audio is not coming through, so I'm going to pause this audio example, and I trust that it will be able to take notes. Many of you, again, will know this chorus, which is sort of an emblem of Italian nationhood and patriotism nowadays. How we came to it becoming an emblem, that's a different story. You will be able to listen to this on your own if you don't know it already. Let me tell you for now that there are countless anecdotes and common assumptions that surround this chorus. Verdi himself, in a powerful autobiographical account written about 40 years after the premiere of Nabucco, which is from 1842, indicated that the words va pensiero sull'ali dorate, which translate as go thought on golden wings, on wings of gold, were central to the genesis of Nabucco, his first success. On a snowy evening, Verdi recounts, Bartolomeo Merelli, the impresario of the Teatro alla Scala in Milan, invited the composer into his office and thrust into his pocket a libretto. Verdi returned home and dropped the manuscript on the table. In his own words, and you can read it here, falling on the table, the sheaf opens on its own. Without knowing how, my eyes stare at the page that lays before me, and this verse appears to me, va pensiero sull'ali dorate. I glance over the following verses and I receive a deep impression from them, especially since they are almost a paraphrase of the Bible, which I've always found pleasure in reading. So I read a passage, I read two, then steadfast in my intention of not composing, I make an effort of will and force myself to close the script and go to bed. No good. Nabucco trots about in my head. Sleep does not come. I get up and read the libretto, not once, not two, 3 times, but 2-3 times so often that in the morning you could say that I knew Solera's entire libretto by heart. Va Pensiero is one of those signature pieces that over a century and a half have been decontextualized and recontextualized in countless ways. It is the number that brings down the house whenever Nabucco is performed. It is the piece that was performed at the ceremony for the translation of Verdi's remains to the Casa di Riposo in Milan, expressing on that occasion that the nostalgia of the people who had lost not their homeland, but someone who had come to stand for the idea of patria. Let me expand on this briefly. In 1901 and to the present day, the doleful song of the Hebrews in Nabucco was broadly perceived as an obvious metaphor for the condition of the Italian people in mid-19th century Italy, subjected to foreign domination. Many biographers and opera experts will tell you that Va Pensiero was encored at the world premiere of the opera, and that it effectively initiated the political movement that led to the Italian revolutions of 1848-49. I hope it will not break anyone's heart to learn that this is simply untrue. Va Pensiero was not anchored at La Scala in 1842. It was actually another chorus from the opera, the closing hymn, Immenso Jehovah, that was anchored. And there is no evidence that Verdi or his audience intended this piece as an expression of Italian patriotism when it first appeared at La Scala. In recent years, there have even been scholars who have taken a revisionist approach to the Risorgimento in general, and in particular to Verdi's involvement in it. While Verdi was self-declaredly a liberal and a patriot and expressed extraordinary enthusiasm for the outbreak of the Milanese revolutions in March 1848, how could we possibly know that he intended Va Pensiero metaphorically to give a voice to the oppressed Italian people? We cannot know, and chances are that he did not mean that, at least not at the outset. At the same time, he certainly realized the dramatic potential of a choral statement, such as the statement of the people enslaved far away from their homeland. In other operas of the 1840s, actually Verdi often exploited the topic of the patriotic chorus. When writing of the text for a chorus in Ernani, for which he was writing the text, librettist Francesco Maria Piave actually confided to a friend and said to that friend, "I hope that the master of Nabucco will find some inspiration in these verses." Thus, at this very early stage of Verdi's career, we're talking about 1844, just a couple of years after Nabucco, really, Piave realized that the Verdian patriotic chorus had become a genre of sorts. And that realization was widespread. By 1845, Verdi's pupil Emanuele Muzio indicated that the Milanese had nicknamed the composer the Papà dei Cori, the dad of the choruses. And the choruses that Verdi fathered became part of what the Italian historian Alberto Banti has described as the morphology of national discourse, a system of communication based on shared signs and symbols that fostered the idea of nationhood in mid-19th century Italy. The assumption that Verdi was the bard of the Risorgimento, as some critics have called him, may be an exaggeration. It is actually during the period after the unification of Italy that the image of the composer, the man of the land and of the fatherland, who gave a voice to the Italian people, became established and even mythicized. The cry of Viva Verdi actually began to be used late in 1858, so quite late, and it was, as many people know, a convenient acronym for Viva Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia, King Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy. Once the Kingdom of Italy was founded, then, the Prime Minister Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour, explicitly requested Verdi to be part of its first parliament, in a gesture that both paid homage to the composer's centrality in Italian culture and sought to exploit his popularity as an artist for the purpose of a political design for the new nation state. So we need to take a balanced approach here. On the one hand, it is an exaggeration to say that the minute Nabucco appeared, Va Pensiero instantly became a statement of patriotism and an image of nationhood for the Italians who sought liberation and unification. It is equally an exaggeration to say that nothing of that sort circulated among the Italian public and critics, for that matter. Very soon, Verdi's choruses came to be viewed again as a genre. Verdi agreed to be part of the first Italian parliament, but he attended irregularly and resigned just a few years later. As he facetiously wrote in a letter, if one wanted or had to write my biography as a member of parliament, one would have to print a beautiful blank page. So in the end, what we're left with when we try to define Verdi's relationship to the Risorgimento and to Italian nationalism and patriotism is not so much his life, but rather the works themselves, how they were interpreted at the time of their first appearance, and also how they were interpreted beyond that time. The equation between life and work developed at a later stage, and it is based on that equation, one could argue, that the people of Milan crowded the streets in February of 1901. For those people, indeed, Verdi may have been a political symbol as much as, or more than, a composer of opera. And in light of this consideration, the large crowd acquires a different meaning for us, and the comparison to political and religious leaders does not appear too far-fetched. Let's now talk about opera, finally. We've been talking about the land, we've been talking about the fatherland, the patria, and now we turn to Verdi and Italian opera, a topic that might seem obvious, that is dauntingly broad, and that I will now tackle on the basis of just a few points that I regard as being quite important. When Verdi began his career, he entered the world of Italian opera through the main door, composing his first 4 operas for the Teatro alla Scala in Milan, and then obtaining commissions to write for the most important opera houses in Italy, and by 1847 internationally. Still, the world of Italian opera at the time was a complex one, inhabited by numerous and diverse agents, including composers, but also librettists, singers, impresarios, and political authorities. Among all of these agents, it was the singers who stood solidly at the top of the hierarchy. In the period before the appearance of Verdi, the most celebrated opera singers were idolized by the public, earned astronomical fees, certainly more than composers earned, and had the authority to request or make changes to the operas they performed. Singers were hired by impresarios, and composers who received a commission were routinely expected to write for the cast available at a given opera house in a given season. And in his early period, actually, Verdi dealt with this status quo and even agreed sometimes to provide so-called non-definitive revisions, meaning replacement arias and other changes at the request of prominent singers. Yet he sought to counter that authority with increasing conviction. And now I want to look at a few moments in the history of Verdi's relationship with leading singers of his time. When Sophia Loewe, the celebrated German soprano who created the role of Elvira in Ernani in 1844, asked Verdi to give her an additional aria at the end of the opera, Verdi refused. And Loewe accepted this status quo and went on stage at the world premiere of the opera with just what Verdi gave her, meaning an aria in Act 1 and then duets and ensemble singing. But as soon as she had an opportunity, Loewe retraced her footsteps, and in January 1845 she sang Ernani again at Verona. This time, Verdi was not present, and so she chose to approach not the composer himself, but rather Ricordi, Verdi's publisher, and sent him the following letter. Ernani, Loewe writes, pleases infinitely, but I find that I have too little solos. So for your great goodness, I would like to show my gratitude to you by adding, after a few performances, my own aria. And you can read it on your own. Loewe proceeds to explain that there is an aria by Donizetti from Donizetti's opera Maria di Rohan that she loves and that she's going to interpolate into Ernani. And this actually did happen. And we should not be outraged by it. On the contrary, this was part of the common practice at the time. But it was a rule of the game that Verdi sought to change. And as his prestige and influence rose, the composer actually lobbied theater impresarios on one hand and his main music publisher, Ricordi, on the other, adding a clause to his contracts to indicate that no alterations could be made to his scores without his written consent. This is not an easy or linear process, to be sure. It is a process through which the role of the composer as author, or even the main author of the opera, slowly came to be fully acknowledged, established. And at the same time, while he was doing that, Verdi also sought to be responsible for the casting of his operas, and even sought to choose his own operatic subjects, only once he knew the singers that would be available to him. And the operatic singer, the opera singer in turn, came to be viewed as something different than a vocal virtuoso, someone who was expected to possess outstanding dramatic skills, to be able to act, and to have a voice suited to her or his part. When, in 1849, the celebrated soprano Eugenia Tadolini was offered the role of Lady Macbeth in Verdi's Macbeth, the composer actually thundered. Tadolini, he said, has a handsome and good figure, and I would want Lady Macbeth ugly and evil. Tadolini sings to perfection, and I would want Lady not to sing at all. Tadolini has a splendid, clear, limpid, powerful voice, and I would want for the lady a sharp, suffocated, dark voice. Tadolini's voice has an angelic quality. I would want the lady's voice to be diabolical. In this letter, Verdi actually went on to indicate, I cannot believe that Tadolini would even consider singing this role. So talking about pressure. Now, fast forward to 4 decades later, 1886, at the time of the composition of Otello. Romilda Pantaleoni, whom you see here, was preparing to create the role of Desdemona in that opera. And all she could do at that stage was to display the utmost respect of Verdi's authority. When she wrote the master on October 9th of 1886, she chose her words very carefully and certainly submissively. I have studied with all my heart and with all my love my favorite role of Desdemona. Let's bear in mind that Otello didn't exist yet at the time. It had been composed, but it had not been performed. But it was already a favorite role for Pantaleoni. And I think I am ready to present myself again to the immortal author, to let him hear something and to receive his sought-after and precious advice. Thus, illustrious maestro, be so courteous as to set your preferred day when I will be able to return to that blessed, beautiful abode where you reside. To you, the deepest gratitude of your most devoted Romilda Pantaleoni. I have chosen, I am aware of this, 3 examples of women whose lives intersected with Verdi's, and it is tempting and to an extent appropriate to read some issues of gender into the opinions and interactions that these documents, that these events outline. We are not going to go into those dynamics, although one certainly can do that. It is important to acknowledge here that analogous dynamics characterize actually Verdi's developing relationship also with male singers, as well as with his librettists, all of whom were male, and some of whom he outright abused in his correspondence. At the outset of his career, Verdi was given librettos that were complete and ready to be set to music, although he then sought to make changes. In Nabucco, for example, he appears to have requested some changes of his librettist Temistocle Solera, supposedly demanding the insertion of new poetry for the prophet Zaccaria. Here you see an image of Temistocle Solera, and we can now read a passage from Verdi's autobiographical account that we looked at before. I locked the door, put the key in my pocket, and half-jokingly I said to Solera, you are not getting out of here until you've written the prophecy. Here is the Bible, you already have the words ready-made. Solera, who had an irascible nature, did not take this tirade well. A flash of anger sparked in his eyes. I had an ugly minute, because the poet was a big man who could have quickly prevailed over the obstinate maestro. But all of a sudden, he sat at the table, and 15 minutes later, the prophecy was written. By the way, it's probably not the prophecy from Act 3 of Nabucco that was involved in this process, but Zachariah's prayer in Act 2. But what matters to us is that the libretto for this opera changed at Verdi's request. As his career progressed and he acquired increasing experience, confidence, and power, Verdi then became responsible, as I mentioned, for choosing the subject of his operas and became increasingly proactive in providing specific instructions and requesting changes of his librettists. It is important to realize that Verdi was a man of his own time, and that what he did because times were ripe for certain changes in the world of opera to take place. Verdi was by no means the first composer to establish this kind of relationship with librettists, or to seek to limit and somehow control the authority of singers. He simply was someone who, in the mid-19th century, turned certain trends into a system of production for Italian opera. We could continue along similar lines, continue to describe ways in which Verdi's work as a composer and his operas may be read as attestations of his political ideals, assertions of his authorial voice, and so on. And I could also tell you, and I will actually briefly, how Verdi reacted to the increasingly oppressive political climate after the failed revolutions of 1848-49. One of the clearest indications of Verdi's political involvement and his intention to be political in his operas actually is if we look at his interaction with the censors throughout Italy. After the revolutions of 1848-49, Verdi actually engaged in fierce confrontations with the censors in Venice at the time of Rigoletto, in 1850, and in Naples at the time of Un ballo in maschera in 1857-58. The opera finally saw the light of day in 1859. Verdi sought to safeguard his freedom of expression from censorial interference. In the case of Un ballo in maschera, and I mention this because Un ballo in maschera is one of the operas planned for the Festival Verdi in Parma this fall, this September and October, the locale of the opera had to be changed, was changed by the censors, who would not approve of the theme of regicide. And at the Festival Verdi this year, actually, we reinstate the original text of the opera that Verdi submitted to the censors in Rome, the text of Gustavo III, the king of Sweden, who was truly assassinated in the late 18th century. When Verdi was struggling with the authorities about the subject matter for the opera that became Un ballo in maschera, Verdi erupted in a very famous statement in a letter to a friend, and he said, "From Nabucco onward, I haven't had, one can say, an hour of peace. 16 years in prison, 16 anni di galera." We could say at this point that here we are cherry picking. Of course, I'm choosing some anecdotes, some well-known, others less so. I'm looking at documentary evidence, and I'm using this evidence to back either facts or worse, assumptions about Verdi's life and work. And I just want to point out again, as I said briefly a moment ago, it would be just as easy and helpful and stimulating to show that Verdi himself was transformed, was affected by the world in which he lived, and that his life, work, political views, interaction with singers, librettists, and censors are all reflections of broad historical trends, cultural transformations, and powerful social forces. It is important to realize that despite Verdi's genius, whom I personally admire and many of us adore and even worship, it is important to realize that opera was at the time and still is a quintessentially collaborative art form. And that although Verdi extended his control over aspects of operatic production that were conventionally outside of the composer's jurisdiction, he also continued to rely on the collaboration and advice of trusted colleagues and friends. Without the singers with whom he collaborated, each and every Verdi opera would have been either very different or would not have existed. And without his colleagues, librettist Arrigo Boito and publisher Giulio Ricordi, for example, an opera such as Falstaff would never have materialized. One question that is worth thinking about is how Verdi was in the private sphere. Verdi certainly knew how to stand for his own ideals, also away from the operatic spotlight. This is evident when one looks at the beginning of his liaison with Giuseppina Strepponi, the celebrated soprano, who had created the role of Abigail in Nabucco and who went on to become Verdi's partner and then his second wife in 1859. Nothing suggests that Verdi had a relationship with Strepponi at the time of Nabucco. Verdi had been married, his two children and wife died prematurely between 1838 and 1840. And it was in 1847, when Verdi traveled to Paris for the first time, that Strepponi and Verdi met again. Strepponi had settled in Paris and soon became Verdi's partner. For years, they spent more time in Paris than in Italy, and in Paris, Verdi experienced the bliss of domesticity compared to the whirlwind of previous years in Italy. That bliss came with a dose of bitterness. Living with Strepponi outside of wedlock, Verdi met the full tide of the provincialism and bigotry of his fellow nationals, exacerbated by allegations concerning Strepponi's earlier personal life. And Verdi took a clear stance on this relationship with Strepponi with no less than his former father-in-law, Antonio Barezzi. To Barezzi, Verdi wrote, "In my home lives a free and independent woman who, like me, enjoys solitary living." Apologies, there is a typing error in the slide. Neither she nor I owe any explanation, must account for our actions to anyone. Even after the couple were married in 1859, the more conservative people around Busseto continued to frown upon their union, and Verdi moaned, "Can't one have individual liberty then, when one lives honestly in one's own house without offending against the laws or morality? I am a liberal to the utmost degree, without being a red. I respect the liberty of others, and I demand respect for my own." Again, it is tempting to draw a connection between Verdi's involvement with Strepponi, thus his own private life, and his work as a composer of opera. In Paris, Verdi had increased exposure to French literature and theater. He arrived in the Ville Lumière too late to meet Marie Duplessis, the celebrated courtesan who had died of tuberculosis earlier in 1847. But he was not late to experience her posthumous enshrinement at the hand of Alexandre Dumas fils, who created first a novel and then a play by the title of The Lady of the Camellias. And it is that play that served as the basis for La Traviata. It's perhaps not surprising that the composer was drawn to the tale of The Lady of the Camellias, in which a female character pursues the dream of moral redemption and of solitary living. And as he wrote to a friend, Cesare de Sanctis, on the 1st of January, 1853, for Venice, Verdi said, "I am doing La Dame aux Camélias, which will probably be called La Traviata, a subject of our own age. Another composer would not have done it because of the customs, the periods, and other silly scruples. But I'm writing it with the greatest of pleasure." Very Verdian tone of defiance. You may have noticed that we have concentrated a great deal on Verdi's early and middle periods, but Verdi lived a very long life, as I mentioned at the beginning. He lived 87 years, and his final opera, Falstaff, appeared in 1893 when he was in his 80th year. Verdi then remained fully functional and exemplarily active until that fateful morning of January 21, 1901. It is legitimate to ask, as we often do today, of people who live a long life and somehow manage to counter physical aging with the youth of their spirit, how did he do it? Such questions cannot be answered straightforwardly. They are philosophical, existential questions, but it is important to contemplate them, especially as we look for inspiration in the life of Verdi. One thing is certain: old age did not happen to Verdi. Old age was met by Verdi and even confronted by Verdi. This was perhaps made easier by the fact that Verdi had thought about old age a lot in the earlier part of his life, depicting many extraordinary aging men in his operas. Let's think about Silva in Ernani, Verdi's first encounter with Victor Hugo. The obsession with old age and physical appearance that characterizes Don Ruy Gomez de Silva, the elderly villain in Hugo's 1830 play, are transposed to Piave's libretto. There are references to Silva's old age that are abundant in the poetry for Ernani. There is no libretto from the 19th century before Ernani that mentions old age so pervasively. Within a few bars, within a few measures following his entrance, actually, Silva himself muses over his dream of love and presents the powerful image of his own youthful heart trapped in an aging body. Here you can read the words of this wonderful passage, and the image of the white of Silva's hair, and of his advancing age, which, however, has not frozen his heart. If you look up this text online, you will be able to find many recordings of this piece, assuming that you don't already know it. One may indeed find traces of physical decay in the more sorrowful chromatic inflections of Silva's aria. But even beyond that aria, Piave's libretto, as I was saying, is filled with images of Silva's old age, which are often accompanied with a tone of repulsion. For example, in Elvira's entrance, questo odiato veglio che quale immondo spettro ognor mi insegue, this hated old man who chases me like a gruesome ghost. And that repulsion is actually transformed into terror when Ernani imagines the old man's infernal laughter and keeps repeating the words il vecchio, il vecchio. Verdi went on then to adapt another play by Victor Hugo, Le Roi s'amuse, into Rigoletto, and in that opera too, the theme of the core, the curse, is intertwined with the theme of old age. Rigoletto keeps thinking of Monterone as being vecchio. And we could continue with I don't want to say countless, but very numerous Verdian depictions of old age, all the way to the Vecchio John, the old John in Falstaff. I will mention only one example and even dare to play it on the piano. It's very late here, so my neighbors might not like this, but we'll take the risk. There is the moment in which the 90-year-old Grand Inquisitor enters the stage in Don Carlos, and this is what it sounds like. And it is an extraordinary moment in which just a couple of measures of orchestral music depict both the fact that this is someone very old, that his steps are uncertain, and also someone that we should be really afraid of. But it is now really time to conclude. And I will conclude briefly by telling you about the Casa di Riposo, where Verdi is buried, a care home for musicians that Verdi funded and founded in 1899. a place where people of either sex who worked for the art of music, who are Italian citizens and who find themselves in a state of poverty, will be accommodated and maintained. This is the bylaws of the Casa di Riposo that Verdi financed. Verdi wrote to a friend with a hint of rhetoric, but very genuinely at the same time. Verdi said, "Among my works, the one that I like best is the home that I have built in Milan for accommodating old singers not favored by fortune, or who, when they were young, did not possess the virtue of saving, the poor dear companions of my lifetime. Believe me, my friend, that home is truly my most beautiful work." And it is to this building, designed by architect Camillo Boito, the brother of Arrigo Boito, the librettist and composer, Verdi's collaborator, that Verdi's remains, together with the remains of Giuseppina Streponi, were taken in February of 1901, with a crowd of 300,000 escorting the composer. In a letter, Arrigo Boito remarked that forgive me, I thought I had the slide for that, but I don't, remarked that now everything is finished, and drawing a comparison with the opera Don Carlos, Boito said, "Now everything is finished. He sleeps like a king of Spain in his Escorial, under a thick bronze sheet that covers him completely." Verdi, indeed, lays at rest under a bronze tombstone in the Casa di Riposo per Musicisti that he established. And that Casa di Riposo is affectionately known in Milan and elsewhere as Casa Verdi, not to be confused with the Villa Verdi, which is the villa at Sant'Agata, as if Verdi had lived there. And it's easy enough for many of us to repeat the words that every day are in the minds and mouths of so many people all over the world. And those words are, of course, Viva Verdi. But just to move away from the rhetorical gesture of this close, we can say Viva Verdi all we want, but Verdi really only lives if we do the work that it takes to understand him, to question him, to bring his works to life, to find meaning in them as the past to which they belong becomes increasingly remote. And for this reason, really, I feel especially privileged to work on Giuseppe Verdi with my students here at the University of Southampton, with the editions of his operas, of his scores. I have one here. I'm not going to try to sell it to you, but these are the editions that we publish, and indeed with the work of bringing Verdi's music to the stage at the Festival Verdi in Parma. Thank you very much for listening to me, and many thanks to my friends and colleagues in Parma for providing technical support. I will now turn off the PowerPoint presentation, and if there are any questions, they will be fielded, and I will be very happy to spend a few minutes with you and try to answer them. Any questions or any comments from our audience in the United States or elsewhere? I'll give it a minute. Okay, I am told from the tech support in Parma that there are actually no questions, and so I would like to thank you for being with me and with us at Teatro Regio and the Festival Verdi, and I wish everyone a pleasant evening and a good night. Thank you.